Let's start with the simple ones, even though this is not in order. Kicker. If you are not familiar with kicker, it's an old mechanic that people really like, and I like. It's an additional casting cost. It's a supplemental casting cost, which you can pay to the card's normal casting cost, and it gives you an extra ability, feature, effect, whatever. Kicker's great. Yeah, everyone loves kicker. Another reason to love kicker is that it's freaking great in draft and sealed. Because oftentimes in draft and sealed, you want a little extra power, or the game is stalled out, and all of a sudden this kicker card becomes much better. So I think it's a great mechanic for limited, and it's a fun mechanic in constructed too. As you can see here on the Academy Drake, the kicker is 4. It's a 2/2 flyer for 3. If you kick it, you get 2+1/+1 counters on it, so it's a 4/4 flyer for 7. This is a common. Oftentimes the kicker cost will seem prohibitive or too expensive. But once again, if you go to the late game and you top deck it, you'll normally have enough mana to pay for it. So I think this is a great mechanic, and it's an old one, and I'm excited for it because I've never really got to play with it. That's all we have to say about kicker. The next one, which is kind of self-explanatory, is hexproof from. This is a pretty easy to understand one. This Knight of Grey says hexproof from black. Creature can't be the target of black spells or abilities your opponent controls. That's it. It's like hexproof, but it's more narrow. And I think a lot of people want that. A lot of people kind of whine about hexproof cards being too hard to interact with and not fun to deal with. Carnage Tyrant being a pretty good example. Shroud is kind of like that. People tend to not really like people don't like the Boggles deck because it's weird and they just get hexproof and you can't really do anything about it and they just boggle off. Yeah, kind of like Circle of Protection black. Yeah, I think it's a fine mechanic. I like it. I like that it's more narrow. I never had a strong opinion either way on liking hexproof and shroud cards. There's still ways to get at them, but it is annoying. I guess in general, I would think about it as annoying. But these are much better. This just means you have to kill it with a red card instead of a black card. And that gives a lot of play to the opponent or whatever for killing these cards. But it also adds a lot of flavor to the card. Like this is a Knight of Grace and there's a black knight that's the same that has hexproof from white. You know, it's great. You have these knights facing off and they're made to defend against each other, but if you surprise them with something else, they're just dead. And I really like that. I think it really adds to the flavor and interaction of the cards. So I'm pretty stoked for this mechanic too, though I don't know if I'll be playing any cards. I don't know if any of these hexproof from cards are going to be good enough. Yeah, man. Hexproof from artifacts. Hexproof from player. I mean, as you said, they already had protection, so they already could do that. Like True Name Nemesis has protection from the opponent. But this is kind of a better way to phrase it since we already have hexproof. Who knows? We may no longer see any cards that are truly hexproof anymore. Yes, I have Pizza Party. If you guys don't know what he's referring to, they're changing the wording of cards. So if a card does damage to a player, right now you can redirect the damage to a planeswalker, but they're changing it now so that the card has to say player or planeswalker to do damage to the planeswalker or any target. And if it says any target, then you could do player or planeswalker. And they're going to errata a bunch of the old cards that say player and either change it to any target or player and planeswalker. That way you can still have cards that only target player but not a planeswalker. Which is weird. Like if you had shock and you could shock the person but you couldn't shock the planeswalker, I think that loses a lot of value. I don't really know what the upside of doing it this way is. Except to make cards more prohibitive. Like maybe something like Fireball is okay to say it only goes to the player. But you could already drain life from a player, you know? You could say the opponent loses 1 life, and that you couldn't get off. You couldn't target a planeswalker with. So they already kind of had the rules in place if they wanted to do that. But I think it's a flavor issue. Because like red burn spells, which I brought up before, don't really have, you can't say opponent loses 3 life. That's what a black card says. A red card says does 3 damage. But now flavor-wise, if they wanted to just target a player, they can just do it without having to say lose 3 life instead. Chandra's +1 is changing only to a player. I mean, that's okay. That stuff is fine. I kind of see why they're doing it, but it's certainly not going to make things... Actually, I guess it sort of makes things less confusing. It's going to be confusing for us people who are used to it. Like, I'll draw a card, I'll be like, all right, I'm going to jam this in the Planeswalker, and then I won't be able to do it, and I'll be like, right, new rules. But there's reasons to have damage only go to a player without having to say lose life. Like, that's the main reason they're doing this, and whatever. It is what it is. Yeah, they seem pretty high on planeswalkers for this Dominaria. I don't want them to print a bunch more planeswalkers, but we'll see. All right, now let's get into the crazy stuff. Let's start with Saga, because I think it's... No, we're going to save Saga for last. Let's go to Legendary Sorcery. Can we just play this? What does this do?
Dominaria Spotlight, Legendary Sorceries. In a set filled with stories, the Legendary Sorceries are perhaps the most fateful tales of all. The word legendary hasn't appeared on a sorcery before, so what does that mean? First, let's see one. The first thing to know is that legendary sorceries are immensely powerful. These are iconic moments from Magic lore.
This card is good.
Most revered characters. Urza's just not having it here, and an Ice Age is born. That's big time. To cast a spell this powerful, you're going to need a little help. Specifically, you must control a legendary creature or planeswalker in order to cast a legendary sorcery. Other legendary permanents, such as legendary artifacts, aren't going to cut it. You're looking for an ally here, a friend, a partner, not just a sword or rock or whatever. Once you cast a legendary sorcery, it doesn't matter what happens to the legendary creature or planeswalker. Even if it leaves the battlefield in response, the legendary sorcery is unaffected. You just needed to control that legendary creature or planeswalker in order to cast the legendary sorcery. Also, there are no restrictions on legendary sorceries other than the game rules. In most formats, you can have up to 4 of each one in your deck, and you can cast any number of legendary sorceries with the same name, even in the same turn.
That's a little weird.
Of legendary sorceries doesn't change the rules for legendary permanents at all. If you ever control more than one legendary permanent with the same name, you get to keep only one, the others go to your graveyard. And those are legendary sorceries. Some of the most powerful spells ever conceived, ready for you. Welcome to Dominaria. Welcome home.
I agree. The requirement for these legendary sorceries is tough. Now, Dominaria seems to be filled with legendary creatures. But still, you could have those rotten in your hand a lot of the time. And speaking of opening up play, this does open up the play space for a legendary instant. They didn't print any of those, but why not have a legendary instant if you can have a legendary sorcery? So it does open the play space up for that. They are super strong. Seems fine. We'll see if they erred on the side of way too powerful or way too restrictive when we get the game going. I agree, Beard. So what I think is very interesting is there seems to be a lot of legendary creatures in Dominaria. And I think it's going to lead to some interesting deck building. Right now, there's pretty much 3 legendary creatures that people are playing a 4 of in Standard. Hazaret, Scarab God, Phoenix. No, wait, Phoenix isn't legendary. What's the other legendary? Hazaret, Scarab God. I should have written it down. Oh, Heart of Kirin. But in general, legendary keeps you from playing 4 ofs. Besides those 3, which are just so good, you just play it. Chandra, I mean, I guess the Planeswalkers are all kind of legendary, so Chandra is also a 4 of in many decks. But in many decks, you could trim one and have a 3 of. So I think it's neat that they're going to put in all these legendary creatures, and I don't they're not all going to be Hazaret. So there's going to be a lot of kind of fun in brewing and deck building and figuring out how many legendary creatures to include. Do you include 2? Do you include 3? Does your deck have a bunch of 1 of legendary creatures? I think it's going to be interesting, and it's going to remind me of Duels a little bit with the rarity restriction. Because you're not just going to be able to jam 4 sets of 4 different legendary creatures. Like, your hand could just fill up and be just stuck, and you don't have any plays until they kill a creature. So I think it's going to be very interesting with the deck building with all these legendary creatures rolling around. Yeah, so I'm excited. And because of that, I think these legendary sorceries aren't going to be as hard as they could seem to be. But I do think it'll be a fun time for deck building. I mean, sure, there'll be some legendaries that are 4 of, like Hazaret, but not that many. I mean, there's a lot of other legendary creatures that we have access to now that people, like Captain Lannery Storm, I don't think anyone's really going to put 4 of those in. 2 or 3 are fine, but 4 seems like too much. I can't think of any other great examples. I mean, for a while, people weren't playing 4 Scarab Gods, but they're pretty much up to 4 now. I don't know. I think it's going to affect brewing and deck making very, very largely, and I think it's going to lead to more variations in decks. Like, you could net deck a deck list and it has 2 of a legendary creature. Well, maybe that creature works out really well for you and you stuff in 3, or maybe it's not working well and you take out 1. So I think it'll be a little harder to net deck, and you'll have to really adjust to how you feel about the cards. Kari Zev, right. So Ganyan's deck had 2 Kari Zev main deck. People were running 4. All right, let's move on to the next one, Historic. This is pretty easy. Do we want to watch these? I really didn't like the last one that much, but we'll watch it.
Historic. Dominaria is all about celebrating the game's history, even as we forge the future. Every card can tell us something about the multiverse and the magic
Yes,
within.
it is California.
But we've decided to focus on 3 kinds of cards that really carry the weight of history: artifacts, legendary cards, and sagas. Collectively, we call them historic cards. Here's Sarah Disciple. Our flying friend gets a combat boost whenever you cast a historic spell. Cast an artifact spell? Check. Cast a legendary creature or planeswalker? Check. Cast a legendary sorcery? Check. Also, legendary sorcery? We're probably going to need another video for that one. Cast a saga? Check. Remember that casting a historic spell means actually casting a spell. Putting a historic permanent onto the battlefield some other way won't cause Sarah Disciple's ability to trigger. Neither will playing a land, even if it's a legendary land or it's also an artifact. But not all historic bonuses care about casting spells. Here's Guardians of Koilos. This construct will happily bounce any other historic permanent you control, even a land, and no matter how it got onto the battlefield. Historic can be used to refer to permanents, spells, or even cards in your hand or library. Just remember that the word historic means artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. You know, the stuff of legend. Welcome to Dominaria.
So basically, historic is just a way to group a certain class of cards, which works really great for the lore of Dominaria. I don't know how much they're going to use this word in the future. $60 legendary cards in standard at the moment, and 3 are 4-ofs in standard decks. 57 are not. Just really nothing special about historic. It's just, I think it's more for flavor and lore and a way to group certain cards in a new way. Because just saying artifacts isn't enough. It's cool. I hadn't thought about legendary sorceries also triggering stuff like that. But let's say it says you can get a historic card from your graveyard. That's pretty badass. That means I could get a planeswalker from my graveyard, I can get an artifact from my graveyard, or I could get a sorcery from my graveyard. That's like a wide... And I can get a creature, you know, a legendary creature. That's a lot of cool things you could choose from your graveyard. I'm not sure that card is out there yet, but it'll probably be there eventually. So this is fine. I think it's cool. There's really nothing special about it. It's just a way to group things. Let's get on to the biggest, most important one. Sagas. I got a lot of idea for these sagas, people. Already.
Dominaria Spotlight, Sagas. Sagas are a new kind of enchantment in Dominaria. Now normally these videos start out with some kind of flavorful intro, but we ain't got time for that, because sagas are unlike anything you've ever seen before.
They're complicated.
Buckle your seatbelts, we going vertical. Sagas like the Flame of Keld represent famous stories from Dominaria's history. Each saga has 3 chapters. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. Each chapter has an associated...
Just because sagas have 3 chapters now does not mean they can only have 3 chapters in the future.
Effect. To track the chapters, you use lore counters. Each saga enters the battlefield with a lore counter on it. This causes the Chapter 1 ability to trigger. Now that ability goes on the stack like normal, and players can respond to it. When that ability resolves, you follow the instructions in the Chapter 1 effect. In this case, you discard your hand. Not the greatest start, but keep reading, the story gets better. As your first main phase starts, that's just after your draw step, you add a lore counter to each saga you control. Now you have to do this, it's not optional, and it just happens. It doesn't use the stack. If you want to mess with your opponent's saga, you probably should do so no later than their draw step. Now that there are 2 lore counters on the Flame of Keld, the Chapter 2 ability triggers. When that ability resolves, you'll draw 2 cards. Much better. For some sagas, the Chapter 1 and 2 abilities have the same effect. Those sagas look like this. The chapter symbols are just grouped up. You may even discover a saga out there that groups up chapters 2 and 3. Very mysterious. Fast forward to your next turn, and we add a 3rd lore counter.
Sorry about that.
Again,
that was ridiculous.
Just as your first main phase starts. Now this all happens before you can cast creatures or sorceries or anything like that. The Chapter 3 ability triggers, and when it resolves, you'll get a nice damage boost for the turn. When a saga's last chapter ability resolves, or is countered, or is just no longer on the stack, the story is over, so you sacrifice the saga. Remember that sagas are enchantments.
It's a good
so
one,
anything
Beard.
that destroys an enchantment can destroy a saga. And that's the story on sagas. 3-turn stories sure to turn the tide of battle in your favor. Time to put the past to work for you. Welcome to Dominaria. Welcome home.
These things are cool. But here, the question is how broken are they? So, here's one of them. Fall of Thrawn. Chapter 1 says, destroy all lands.
Oh boy!
Wow. Wow. That's all I can say to that. Now, my question for the commentariat, and I couldn't even tell from how the guy said it in that video, which was the first time watching the video. Yes, California. But you can't mess with the... Well, let me just get right to my point. So this says, destroy all lands, chapter 1. And then there's this card. So my question is, if you had... How much does this one cost? 6? If you had 9 mana available, could you play the Saga, then play Solemnity, and basically destroy all lands every turn? Because if that's the case, I am playing mono white artifacts. I'm just going to put a bunch of mocks and power stones. They're a little weird on how those lore counters go on, because they say you can't like really interact with it. It just gets put on. The top of the card does not say that when a lore counter's on it, it triggers. It just says, as it enters or after you draw a step, add a lore counter. But this says, counters can't be put on enchantments, and Saga is an enchantment. I don't know. Because it also says you can add an extra counter, like using Doubling Season. Or, I assume Winding Constrictor would also work. And in the case where you put 2 tokens on instead of 1 at the beginning, you actually trigger chapter 1 and 2. You don't skip right to chapter 2. You trigger both chapters. I still don't think there's a clear whether or not putting the counter on actually triggers the Saga, or whenever it's your draw step, it looks at the amount of counters and then triggers the Saga. Because if you could stick Fall of Thrawn on 1 and it just destroys all lands every turn, and then I play my mono white Karn deck or something, and all my mana is in artifacts, Orazka relics and mocks and power stones, I would do that. That seems like a lot of fun to me. I don't know. I am very unclear on this. It doesn't say that the lore counter triggers the fall. Now we can look at it. They wrote a lot about it here. It says, when a lore counter is added to a saga, look at the new number of lore counters it has. The chapter ability matching that number will trigger. So this sentence kind of sounds like you need to add a lore counter to trigger the ability. Okay. All right. Well, bummer. Because I wanted to destroy people's lands every turn for the rest of the game. That sounded super fun to me. Okay. So this is kind of off the board, but it's interesting. You can strand other people's sagas with this, which might be worth doing. Like initially this card was kind of like maybe you played it against energy because energy was so oppressive. But now that this card can kind of shut down sagas, maybe it'll see even more applications. It's also good against Sultai Constrictor. Deceiving, what is up? Yeah. I'm not quite sure who you are, so introducing yourself with a YouTube link is a little bit sketchy to me. Welcome to the stream, and maybe we'll check that YouTube link out in a bit. I think we just watched that one. I appreciate you coming in this evening, but I think you can understand my wariness. Anyways, let's just talk about sagas a bit. These cards are cool, I think. They're enchantment, so enchantment hate should probably go up, which means cast outs and Ixalan's bindings. That kind of stuff is still going to be pretty good. And I think now that we got it sorted out, it's pretty clear. The effects are all triggered abilities, basically. So you can interact with them like a triggered ability. Putting the lore counters, you can't really interact with, though Solemnity should at least stop the lore counters. And then this card, for example, says sacrifice after chapter 3. But it says that specifically. So as I said earlier, you could have a 5-chapter saga card, and it would just say sacrifice after chapter 5. Or a 2-chapter saga card and says sacrifice after chapter 2. Now I doubt they would do. It doesn't make any sense to make a 5-chapter card that says sacrifice after chapter 3. Maybe someone would find a way to get around that or something weird. But these cards are interesting. Like, for example, Fall of Thrawn versus History of Benalia. Fall of Thrawn seems a little bit more like the Mythic to me with the Destroy All Lands. But maybe this one is just so cheap that it's fine. What camel is that? Well, we're not going to go into too many cards here. We'll look at a few different sagas because this is totally brand new. Unlike Kicker or Hexproof from, Legendary Sorcerer is pretty brand new, but it's not that special. These are pretty special. So it looks like they have I don't know if they're going to do one for every rarity, but here they have an uncommon, a rare, and a mythic saga in white. By the way, I like this art on Karn. I don't mean to start spoiling these cards early, but I totally love this art on Karn. For Temporal Sundering. Just love it. No common sagas. Okay. But it seems like every color is going to get a uncommon, rare, and a mythic saga, which is great. This one's pretty sweet. It costs a lot, but it's pretty sweet for blue. I'm trying not to look at the other cards. I guess we don't see the blue saga yet, or the blue mythic saga. Chainer's Torment. Phyrexian Scriptures is mythic. Yeah, so there's no telling whether we get one for every rarity but common, but it seems like they would do it that way. Quarry Hauler. Right, they're non-legendary. Phyrexian Scriptures is nutso. There's a lot of nutso stuff. I want to talk about it. See, I did a really good job insulating myself from the spoilers, but I wanted to do this mechanics segment before I did the whole set review with Ninja, so I had to look. And now I'm spoiled, and there's a lot of fun things to talk about, but we're not going to do it. We're going to save it for the set review. Except for these. Flame of Keld seems pretty good. As someone said, for like red deck wins, which is bad because I don't want red deck wins to be better. Oh my god, I wanted to show another card. I'm not doing it. Song of Fairluise. This is one of the ones that has a double chapter. This is pretty cool. Can ramp out super fast. And I don't think there's any multicolored sagas that yet. Or colorless sagas. Anyways, it's gonna be interesting to see the way counter manipulation works with these sagas. And how people try to bust them. Like using Winding Constrictor and doubling season and Solemnity. And you can even use like what's that pirate that steals a counter? So that's a question. Let me... If you remove a counter... It doesn't trigger if you remove a counter. But it will trigger again when it adds the counter next time. Find a way to remove a lower counter from Saga that doesn't cause any of its abilities to trigger. But if you add 2 counters, then 2 abilities will trigger at the same time. What is that guy? Skyship Plunderer. So this guy can put a counter on a saga during the damage phase, I guess, of combat. So that's kind of interesting, is being able to trigger your sagas at combat as opposed to at the beginning of draw step like they're intended to be triggered. This card might see some play depending on how strong sagas are. I think, is it from Kaladesh? Probably from Aether Revolt, actually. I'm not sure, but this card is interesting. And to be able to trigger a saga at like a point people aren't used to, it would be pretty cool. I'm not sure what other cards really do that besides Skyship Plunderer. But I'd be interested in testing that out. It's Revolt. Yo, Anthony J. Gower.
Yeah.
Thanks for showing up. Animation module. Okay. Initially it talks about +1/+1 counters, but the second part just says choose a counter. It doesn't say choose a +1/+1 counter. Give that permanent or player another counter. Yep. So that's cool too. Perhaps that's better than Skyship Plunderer, depending on what you want to do. Release to the wind or any other blink effect.
You have been well trained, my young apprentice. they will be no match for you.
See, you guys are already brewing. That's good. That's good. Thank you, Anthony J. Gower, for that follow. What up?
Yeah.
It's cool. It's a new mechanic, and of course, people are going to try to break it and manipulate it. In Arena, though, we probably don't have that many options because we don't have that many cards right now. It's hard to really test and break things in Arena, and that's a bit of a bummer for me, but we're working with a partial economy, and that's the way life is right now. But I'm pretty psyched for Dominaria just based on these mechanics. Historic and legendary sorceries are just kind of meh. I'm psyched for Kicker to be back. Hexproof From seems like a good mechanic for the future. I think it's a total flavor win. And sagas seem really interesting, and we're going to see where they go with these. My question for sagas is, like, how many other sets are they going to do these in? Dominaria is a very historic kind of legendary set. But all it has to do is tell a story. It doesn't necessarily have to tell one of the greatest stories of all time. Like, you could tell a story in Ixalan of vampire conquistadors beating up some dinos, and that could be a saga. I just don't know. I don't know how to judge these really yet, Anthony, until... I'm going to judge them in the set review, but until I play with them, I'm not really sure. This seems like a pretty good late game card for red deck wins. You're probably out of cards anyways, so you discard your hand, which is fine. Like, if you're in top deck mode and you draw this card seems pretty good. You playing with proxies already? Cheating. Cheating, Anthony. You can post them in chat. What time is it? We're about done here.